I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. Why Islam? Now I'm going to discuss the question, why believe in prophets? Prophets and messengers, they were the people whom God Almighty chose for His message to be delivered to the mankind through them. They were the representatives of the Almighty. Obviously, when a prophet claims that he is a representative of the Almighty, his claim needs to be verified. Somebody who acknowledges it has to justify as to why he has acknowledged an individual to be from God. In order for us Muslims to be able to confirm the claims of all the prophets or all the known prophets of God, it's about enough that we confirm with arguments the claim of the last prophet Muhammad, may God's mercy be on him. It's because the last prophet, if his prophethood is confirmed and it's also logically clarified that he was the last prophet of God, then it would be enough for an investigator, for a reader of the Quran to feel comfortable that the claim of the last prophet is justifiable, convincing, makes a lot of sense. If that's established, then the claim of all prophets coming before him would be, as a consequence, established as well. So, when we discuss the question about why we should believe in prophets, it would be not an exaggeration to say that the question boils down to one particular aspect of this whole understanding, and that is to confirm and believe that Prophet Muhammad, may God's mercy be on him, was indeed the Prophet of God. Now, how do we know that the Prophet who claimed to be the Prophet of God, who brought the Book of God, the Quran, was actually God's Prophet? That his claim is correct, that his claim makes sense. In order for the reader to feel comfortable with the claim, the Quran has presented 4 categories of arguments to enable the reader, the investigator, to feel comfortable, not necessarily immediately overnight, but gradually as a consequence of learning more and more about the Quran. The 4 categories of arguments are talking about then arguments, evidences that ultimately establish to an open-minded, honest seeker after truth that the Prophet indeed was God's representative. Those 4 categories are the category of the character of the Prophet, the category of the message which the Prophet brought along, the category of the prophecies that were there in the earlier books before he arrived, and his arrival confirmed those prophecies, and finally, a prophecy that the Prophet himself made through the Quran, that an extremely important change would take place, unlikely, improbable at the time when it was stated, when the claim was made, but he lived to see that change, the transformation taking place, even though when the claim, the prophecy was made towards the beginning, it seemed as if it wasn't a very likely possibility. So I'll take all these 4 categories of claims one by one to show that this understanding that Prophet Muhammad, may God's mercy be on him, was indeed God's representative, this claim is correct. Let's take the first category of arguments first. The Prophet had a character which was presented by the Quran to the people who were considering this claim that the book that is being presented is a book from God, and that the man who is presenting the message is the Prophet of God. The Quran says that لَقَدْ لَبِثْتُ فِيكُمْ عُمْرًا مِّن قَبْلِهِ. The Prophet is saying to the people of Mecca and the surroundings that I've lived with you for a lifetime before this, before presenting this message. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Do you not ponder? Do you not use your intellect? There are two aspects in particular that this statement is emphasizing. One, that the Prophet had an impeccable character even before his declaration, announcement that he was God's representative. And B, the Prophet, before he made an announcement that he is receiving God's message, had never ever shown any inclination towards receiving a message from God or looking at the realities which were hidden, the unseen realities of this world. Let's take the first argument first. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, lived for 40 years in Mecca, in a town where there were very few people. Everybody knew everybody else. Such was the case with the towns and the populations where people would live together, with all other towns and populations distanced from them by a great margin. It wasn't possible for people not to know each other. The character, the habits, the attitudes, the interests of all people living in a certain society, in a certain location, were known to others. In Mecca, there were all kinds of people. There were people who were indulged in vices which were known. There were people who would tell lies, who would cause harm to others. We know that idolatry was rampant. There were people who were indulged in usurping wealth illegitimately at the expense of people who were weak. The wealth belonging to orphan children were forcibly taken by the strong people. People would amass wealth and would not consider the legitimacy of the process of getting wealth any significance. In this scenario, where all kinds of vices were practiced and people were indulged in them, there was a unique, outstanding person who was known as As-Sadiq Al-Amin, the truthful and the trustworthy. That person was Muhammad, God's mercy be on him. He lived a life which all people could see, and his attitude, his behavior, his demeanors were known to everybody. And he, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say, was the favorite of all. He was therefore chosen by a rich lady, Khadija, to make an offer to him when she experienced from him the trade that he did on her behalf, and she found through her employee that the manner he conducted the entire trading episode, the entire trading journey was outstanding, had no flaws, no blemishes, nothing that could be doubted. And ultimately, when she was highly impressed by his performance, she offered to the man to marry her, and they got married. Khadija, his wife, was the first lady to confirm that the message that the Prophet had received when he started receiving divine revelation was indeed from God, because she had seen him for the last 15 years of her association with him as his wife, that he was a man of impeccable character. It was this clear understanding about the Prophet that enabled him to invite people towards him when he called for the attention of the people who were gathered around the Mount of Safa. He asked them if he was to claim that there was an army of enemies who were getting prepared to attack, would they believe him? And they all said in one voice that he was as-Sadiq, the truthful, Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and therefore it was not possible to imagine that he would be telling a lie. It's another matter that after he made the announcement that he was receiving God's message and that what people were doing in religious matters was something that was strongly condemned by the Almighty, the people who had gathered, most of them turned his enemies, not because they doubted his character, but because what they heard was going against the traditions of the society. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was considered to be so trustworthy that even though many people of Mecca turned his enemies after he started preaching the message of God, because it didn't suit their status quo, it was against the traditions of their forefathers, but they still found him the most reliable person to keep their valuables with him. So when ultimately, after spending 13 years in Mecca delivering the message of God, he was forced to leave the city because some people were after his life. He left behind the valuables that people had entrusted him with to be returned to the rightful owners. He asked his cousin Ali to stay back and do the job. This indeed is remarkable. And therefore, when the Quran made this claim that this message that the Prophet is delivering is from God, and there was no reason whatsoever that the people of Mecca would justifiably deny it, doubt it, because of the fact that they know very clearly the man is absolutely reliable because of the character that people have seen of him. The second aspect of this statement, which says that I have lived with you over a lifetime, do you not then use your intellect, refers to the fact that when a person makes a presentation which is of very high literary quality, like the Quran is, you ought to first see the individual preparing for it. There's a lot of effort which is undertaken in order for somebody to be in a position to make an impressive presentation, literary presentation in any language. You can't do it without practice. That on one hand, that reality on one hand, and the fact that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was not even trained to read and write. This is what the Quran mentions, that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, he had no formal education. He could not write, he could not read. And yet, after living for 40 years with the people of Mecca, showing a character which was impeccable, people used to admire him, and he was considered to be the noblest of the people of Mecca. He presented a book which mentioned information, knowledge that was not immediately available to anyone at the time when the book was being presented. There was no preparation on the part of the Prophet that people could see that he was undergoing. There was no inclination and interest on the part of the Prophet regarding the unseen world, regarding matters that had to do with religious injunctions and all other aspects of the presentation of Quran that were presented by the Prophet were not the subject matter which the Prophet had shown inclination, interest in understanding and taking interest in. So, when the Quran was presented, the Almighty asked the Prophet to tell the people of Mecca that, is it not a fact that I have lived with you for such a long time and now I have presented to you this message of God? Would they not take it seriously even now, knowing full well that this remarkable presentation had come about without any prior indication? So, the Quran presents a number of arguments to the people who were the immediate receivers of the message. The first and foremost argument that they received was that here is a man who is claiming to be God's messenger, God's prophet, and you know him full well. If you deny that the message is from God, then you are actually denying a man whose upbringing, whose character, whose interests you have viewed, observed directly from very close. So, if you are saying that this message is not from God, you are actually making a claim that what you have observed and witnessed for the last 40 years or so was what you are now denying and rejecting, which obviously is something that would not be possible unless a person does not want to understand and accept what is being presented to him.